As you've heard, my name is Michael Wieder. Um, I could not understand at first the invitation via Jackie Callis Carew, and I, in my normal fastidious way, stalled and stalled, prayed about it. And eventually I got a call from Amira, and it had been preceded by a week-long retreat upon the west coast of our province. And I have been through a very difficult year in that post-COVID, we have had struggled to get suitably skilled clergy persons to minister at our cathedral because you need quite a diverse skills base to work in that terrain. And a lot of us are often intimidated by it. And I had one wonderful colleague who had been periodically ill and not able always to participate as we needed him to, and as he would as much love to have been the active pastor of his calling. And so the week before going on the pre-Lenten, starting with Ash Wednesday, Marcus, my colleague, wasn't able to go, so it would just be myself. And the whole purpose of the retreat is to withdraw so that you can engage as you enter into a most important season within the Christian history and calendar, because it leads to the formation of the institution of the church and the creedal statements of our belief. And my prayer to our Creator was, I didn't invite myself to the cathedral. And it was your cathedral before I came, and it will be yours long after I am but dust and memory in the mind and in the heart. So I am going on this retreat, and I need the strength that you will provide me to be your priest and pastor. And it was in that context that I received the call from Amira, engaging me and motivating as she did it. And I thought so of Archbishop Emeritus Desmond Tutu at that point, because like many of my contemporaries, he would be our call of information, of support. And I would have gone to him, as I've done in many other occasions when I was confused. But I'm sure he would have said to me, Mr. Dean, you are being soaked in glory. Go for it. And I channeled that energy and that commitment. And so I stand here before you, consequent to 2 weeks of staying and being on leave, a bit of a busman's holiday in the city of New York, and being totally in love with the architecture of that great city. Seeing the poetry of the murals in Brooklyn, and the way the public gaze is engaged by artists, both the architects and those of the spoken word, and those who use murals to communicate the essence of the spirit and of the heart. And I was accompanied for part of the journey with my beloved wife, Bonita, and I'd been Googling all kinds of interesting comments about architecture, because as we say in Afrikaans, wat weet 'n mens, of wat weet 'n mol van kaas? What does a mole know about cheese? And I'm in that category of a cheesy, ill-equipped, low literacy concerning architecture. And I asked Benita, I said, can you remember in the 80s that quote that I used to say about Goethe? And I quoted the quote, and it says that people are to be loved and things are to be used. Immorality starts when things are loved and people are used. And she said, yes, I don't know if it's Gute, but I think the pronunciation is Gita. So I thought, okay, let's kick that quote to the curb. And so my intention of being here with you, and I've titled my reflection, I think Keynote is a very grandiose title and description, and I would suggest you reserve it for the guy or the woman who comes later after me at another period. But I've recalled and as a storyteller and as a pastor, I call my reflection the locus of architecture, a perspective from the palaces of memory. And that is a reference to our African saints of the Levant of North Africa, Augustine of Hippo, which is now in the country of Algeria. And he was a trained orator, and at a time when civilization did not have the benefits of iPads or even any recording equipment to work with your memory, orators who were skilled in rhetoric, as Augustine was in his day, before his conversion and subsequent to that. He would use spatial memory within the way the memory worked to resource and to access ideas and to repeat it and to share that with his contemporaries at a given time. And so it's the palaces of memory that he talks about in his wonderful book, The Confessions. But I just need to fast forward because I have a poem that I'd like to read to you, and I see my battery is not going to last long. And it concerns the heart of the spatial memory that I'd like to engage you and to share with you my experience of the architecture in the company of these four persons that I was part of as we went to different parts of particularly the Western Cape and also in Pretoria and in Johannesburg. And in many of the places that we visited were places very near and dear to my memory and the people that I administered to. There was, for example, our little sojourn in Newlands. And when I was in one of the houses there, and I looked walking down Kildare Road in Newlands, near the Anglican Church, I was reminded of Mr. Adams, a very gentle, quiet man who had been a merchant seaman when he was young. And he recalled one day when I was doing some huisbesoek in warmer state, just lovely vista of the harbor and of the mountain, the Gurikama behind us. And he said they used to live in Newlands. And when he and his brother, as young men in the early 20s, had gone to sea, they came back after months and found the home and the welcome that they anticipated was not there because group areas had taken its vicious effect. And just by shopping around and hearing, they got no support from the church of which they belong, St. Andrews. There was no anticipation of these young men coming into a closed door and to an empty house, and they had to go, and eventually they were directed to Heideveld, which is right there on the Cape Flats, underdeveloped at that time in the 60s. And Mr. Adams said the whole day they were looking around and they couldn't find it, and eventually they were walking back and going to sleep on the grounds of their old home in Newlands when a fellow recognized Mr. Adams Sr. and he said, and I'll translate, he said, "Ek het jou geken deur jou rol, your gait, your Tsotsi style walk," identified him, and in that familiar, he was unable to direct him. Another incident came when we were reflecting in a parish of St. Philip the Deacon in Chapel Street, District 6, about the memories of the congregation about forced removal. And there was a priest visiting, Father Bob the Ma, who had just come from Port Elizabeth and had been the parish priest in Manenberg. And he recalled how on one cold Cape winter evening, getting a message that he must come, there were people newly arrived from Newlands. And he came to this block of flats, and it was raining, and there was this beautiful furniture standing outside, including an oak wardrobe. And this beautiful wardrobe had been in the family for decades. And now they arrived in the small flat on the second floor of the Lana, of the Thames, as they called it, in Manenberg. And it was too small to be taken into their home, their new home. And it had to be disassembled and reassembled inside. And when it was reassembled, it was far too big. There was no space for the bed. And so eventually it became symbolic, iconic of where life had brought them. From the beauty and from the lushness to new beginnings. And so it is in that sense that I share this reflection in dedication for those who were not overcome and to those who were. For our people from South End and East Bank, Greenpoint and the Buka, from Sophia Town, Maduleke, Katomaina, Fitas, and Clarewood. And to those who found a heart again in Bontas, in Manenberg, in Nyanga, Phoenix, and Aldos, Corrie and Chatsworth, Langa and Bosman and Mamelodi. Moving from Oak Avenue, Newlands, from a house so big you could dance the square in it, to one small like a locked dream or a thought, homeless between tongue and lip, lured by what to do and where not to go and whom to love or not. Where your heart could not hear the Lisbic, a sun-sharp slip away, lushing from beyond and high above where the mountain goats could be seen and the river singing, seek to seek. Among the arum lilies you picked for your mum or for the altar of St. Andrew's for any high feast or holy day. The river song which woke and lulled from summer dawn to winter mist, now still among the flatland dunes of Feichis and Sirangs, and where the wind blows unloved by hedge or oak, from where your name was known, and the door was always open to your smile. A few weeks ago, just before the Easter feast day, a visiting person who identified as a Catholic, she told me as I greeted her at the door, she said, I thought this was a Catholic church, but I really enjoyed it. I said, yeah, God is for everybody. And he loves Catholics also. She said, yes, indeed. I said, yes, but Anglicans are his favorites. And it's true. In some ways, there is a historical bias and weightiness that the mainline churches have to carry. And it's there in our architecture. It is there in the Herbert Baker work of art that we have in our city, right between the provincial legislature and the Houses of Parliament. It is there. It is there in everything that speaks of greatness and wonder. It is also there where the journey of the funeral of the late Cecil John Rhodes goes from our cathedral, St. George's, where he's buried from, and where he is interred in the Matopo Hills of the then Rhodesia. And it is that particular history that comes to light after my installation on the 11th of May 2011 as the 19th Dean of St. George's Cathedral, where a very lovely, proud, dignified, long-serving member of the church of the cathedral came to me and said, "Mfundisi, when are we going to take down those flags in the St. David's Chapel?" And I smiled at her and I said, "I am only the third black dean. Colin Jones was here before me and he was succeeded by Rowan. Why do you want me to expose myself to possible lynching?" And I said, "Mayor, I am guided by what Chinua Achebe says. When people who do not look like you tell your story, let it stand." Let me segue away from that moment to the reality of who tells your story. A few years ago, Dr. Anand Busak brought out a book and he was quoting a statement from a preacher in Harlem, "When the Pharaoh looks like you." When the Pharaoh looks like you on the eve of our Freedom Day. When the Pharaoh knows your clan name, when he sings your greeting, when he knows everything that is lovable about you, when the Pharaoh looks like you, what are your stories? And who do you tell it to? Augustine says here, "I come to the fields of vast palaces of memory, where are the treasures of innumerable images of all kinds of objects brought in by sense perception." And then he recalls how many memories flood and clutters and demands his attention inappropriately to where he is or was at a given instant of his life. And he goes on, he said, "Hidden there is whatever we think about when I am in this storehouse. I ask that it produce what I want to recall." He then details how this rushing flood of memories, clamoring for attention, offering itself for what it believed to be his need in that moment. And he says, "With the hand of my heart," proclaimed Augustine, "I chase them away from the face of my memory until what I want is freed of mist and emerges from its hiding places. Other memories come before me or demand with ease and without any confusion in their order." One of our great Cape griots, a librarian, a prominent long-arm jazz musician, Vincent Colby, reflecting on the words of our then President Thabo Mbeki around the Land Act and how the land must be returned to the people who have been taken off the land. And Vincent talks about the RDP of the soul. He says, what about the people that have been evicted from their souls, who have been taken away from their memories? And so when we take an Augustine, an orator of note, schooled in the privilege of his time and having full hegemonic understanding of his locus in life, he is able to meander and to give us the gifts of civilization as it was constituted in his time. But when we stand as we do, and we have no recall of who we are, and of how creolization has mystified so much of our stories, and our stories no longer exist in the written form because it never did. When the Pharaoh looks like us, held intention against the people who do not look like us and yet tell our stories. Chinua Achebe completes that statement. He says, and then you let those stories stand, and then you tell your stories, and the world can choose. And one of the stories of my life is this understanding of the land question, that the Kuku or the Khoisan people who live in the DNA of so many of us, white and black, in this land. They, as many thought shapers on the land question, in the ancient of days, they said, the land does not belong to us. We belong to the land. When my son was born, Andile, the Muslim matron came and she asked, would I like to have the afterbirth? I didn't quite understand that time because I had a son. And then I realized that she wanted, as a continuation of a certain practice within our city, for the afterbirth to be buried in the ground as part of the sacred act of creation and of life-giving. And so when we say the land does not belong to us, but we belong to the land, it is shaped and it's formulated by life experience. When I was a 8-year-old, 9-year-old, we used to sing a Guma Lichi. Uhari pati nari kramatu, nari kramatu. How does a road wind towards and past the Kramat, the shrine of Islam? It's only later, in my 30s, in my 40s, that I understood that it was a freedom song. But we hadn't known it was just something that we entertained, and we used the Guma drum to beat our rhythm and to engage our social life. But the Kramat in my own life, when I became dean, I found that I could not pray in our cathedral. I struggled to pray in our cathedral. It was in that context that I had a growing understanding that before there had been a cathedral, there was the lushness of the land, artesian streams flowing under and into the sea. And for it to have that Herbert Baker monument to greatness and to how the church understood God's place in Africa by this beautiful structure, it was also a place of displacement. And there was too much memories and too many ghosts dancing and seeking the wounded eland of our history and of our times that was speaking to my soul. And for weeks after that, I found my way to the Kramat on Signal Hill, where I would take my shoes off and fall asleep in the silence of prayer that had been gathered there over centuries of time, that provided sanctuary for those who were escaping from urban slavery up into the mountain, going over to Hout Bay or further along to Cork Bay to find a sympathetic seaman or a boatman to take them across the Falls Bay to the Hangberg maroon community of escaped slaves. Hukhani Pachinari Kramatu. How does the road go was an information coded way of saying you will find food and temporary shelter as you go upon your journey. And so the Kramat becomes a marker, an architectural marker of the freedom road that is so undertold a few hours before Freedom Day. And so I came here this evening, and I'm, you know, when you're out of your depth, you look for something. And there's Bashir, and he looks like my cousin. I said, I got family. And then Bogart comes and he gives me this book. The title is A Life Too Short. Janet Smith and Bogart, Trump, and Chris Hani. And I said, DCO. I put him down here to give me strength. It's my touchstone. But it also serves to remind me of what Freedom Day is and should. And you are right. We can't always blame the pharaohs who look like us. My ouma het al gesê, moenie buite toe kyk, kyk binne toe. Look inside, don't just look beyond. And so this freedom stories, the Kramat songs, the way architecture is there, and it is a marker that is subverted by this dancing priest who doesn't say, I'm a Sotho speaking Xhosa man, dancing my way. He was just Desmond Mpilo Tutu. And he contested the colonial legacy. A colonial legacy that was silent on enslavement, a colonial legacy that if I was an Afrikaner woman, man, or child coming into the St. John Chapel and I see this plaque in memory of the governor that had oversight and ruling presence in the Cape during the time of the Anglo-Boer, what do you know, the Freudian slip, the Anglican, the MAF. The Anglo-Boer War and the concentration camp where poor women and children were incarcerated. Our cathedral is silent about that. But Desmond doesn't even address it. But he makes it a high tower of freedom. Just for him to come in there as an archbishop, the Makulu pastor of the Anglican Church, and he laughs. And he makes jokes about himself and about God as almost a Groot Boeta just around the corner, and Jesus was a cousin named Tsepo. That is our architecture. Not one iota of the brickwork or the tiles or whatever has been changed, but the pure presence of intention, of affirmation, gave me a new understanding of how we work with our past and the place of architecture. And so when we discover a burial ground at the western end of the city called the Prestwick Burial Ground that was meant for enslaved people and free black people who were not church affiliated, and so you could not be buried out of the burial grounds of the mainline churches. And so in the stealth of night, they would bury their dead. And over time, these graves were uncovered by developers. And many of us protested against the development, and the compromise that emerged from that was an ossuary that was built for the skeletal remains of the Prestwick dead. And today, the front of it is a coffee shop called Truth. It's about the coffee and not about our soul and the stories. And one of the architects that accompanied us was Lucien Lagrange. And there was a simple device that he enacted when he helped with the design of the ossuary. And it's just as you enter, all it did was lower the drempel or the threshold and the frame of the entrance, so that when you walk in, as if you were about to salah in a sacred space. And so the genius of architecture enables us also in that dance of creativity, of envisioning, but being rooted in understanding of what we want and how we want this world to be, not like in New York or Germany or other parts of the world, but how we are as a creolized, Africanized people, white and black, how we work with that. So, beloved, in conclusion, I want to leave this thought with you. Wolfgang von Goethe, he says there are only two lasting bequests we can hope to give our children. One of these is roots, and the other is wings. Roots and wings. There's a certain permanency, one which is doable and one which is tied with, that is aspirational, as we stand where we are in this time when pharaohs look like us but do not love us. And so what I have experienced and engaged was, it's not only the structure of the built environment, it's how you work with space in between. That is part of the architectural genius. And what happens in the homestead space, in the entertainment space, in the whatever we call spirituality space, that gives value and meaning to our lives. A story from the monastic tradition is about a pilgrim traveling through some countryside, and it's dawn, the sun is coming up, and he sees a crowd of men busy in the field, and he goes to the one and he says, "Are you monks?" And he said, "Yes, I am the abbot." And he says, the pilgrim says, "It's good to see you building a abbey, a monastery." He says, "No," says the abbey, "we're not building a abbey. We are tearing it down." "Oh, for whatever reason," said the pilgrim. "Oh," says the abbot, "we just want to see the sunrise."